Wyoming, 2003. A confession has finally brought an end to more than 2 decades of silence, reopening wounds this small town thought had long since scarred over. The name that once faded from missing posters and evening broadcasts is being spoken again, softly, painfully, but with something close to peace. Her name was Lena Mae Caldwell, 24 years old. She worked part-time at a diner off Highway 14 and took night classes at the community college in Sheridan. She dreamed of becoming a teacher. Friends said she was the kind of person who never left without saying goodbye, the kind who remembered birthdays, lent gas money, and made the best peach cobbler in town. And then, one night in June of 2003, she was simply gone. Her car, a silver '98 Honda Civic, was found on a narrow gravel road outside town, about 4 miles past where the pavement ended. The driver's door was open, keys still in the ignition, headlights off, one shoe lying in the grass. Deputies arrived before sunrise. There were no footprints leading away from the car, just wind-blown dust and early morning chill. Inside, her purse sat on the passenger seat. The only thing missing was her cell phone, a small flip phone, the kind that could barely hold 20 photos. The discovery rattled the community. Sheridan wasn't the kind of place where people vanished, the kind of place where everyone waved at the postman and left their cars unlocked at the grocery store. But by the end of that first week, Lena's photo, a bright face framed by brown curls and a nervous smile, was taped to every storefront window, bulletin board and gas station counter across the county. Her mother, Helen Caldwell, stood outside the diner the next morning, clutching a stack of flyers. "She's out there somewhere," she told the local news camera. "She wouldn't just leave." Her voice was firm but trembling. Behind her, co-workers wept quietly as they pinned up signs that read, "Missing. Please help find Lena." The first 48 hours were frantic. Search teams combed fields, creek beds, and old farm trails. Dozens of volunteers from nearby towns joined in. Helicopters scanned the surrounding ranchland. Dogs picked up a scent that ended abruptly near a small bridge along the Tongue River. Detectives collected tire impressions, cigarette butts, and a few stray fibers from inside her car, but nothing stood out. There were no signs of a struggle, no forced entry, no broken glass. It looked like she'd just stopped, stepped out, and vanished into the darkness. Investigators interviewed everyone she knew, her classmates, co-workers, friends from church, her ex-boyfriend, and the late-night regulars at the diner. Everyone said the same thing. Lena was steady, careful, reliable, no debts, no trouble, no enemies. But then came one unsettling clue. On the night she disappeared, a trucker passing through the area reported seeing a woman standing by a silver car, talking to a man in a dark pickup. It was near 11:30 p.m., and the witness said the man was tall, wearing a cap, his hands moving animatedly as they spoke. When deputies canvassed the area, no one else had seen them. The description, a dark pickup, no license plate remembered, wasn't much to go on, but it was all they had. Weeks passed, then months. By autumn, the posters were sun-bleached and peeling. The reward fund had stalled, and the Caldwell family was living in quiet suspension. Helen kept Lena's room exactly as it was. The unmade bed, the half-read paperback on the nightstand, the faint smell of her vanilla shampoo still lingering. Every day she'd walk to the mailbox, hoping for something, a letter, a tip, anything. But there was only silence. In late 2003, a hunter found a single sneaker, half buried in the brush near Red Butte Creek, 12 miles west of where Lena's car had been found. The make and size matched the one missing from her car, but DNA analysis at the time yielded nothing. The creekside area was searched again, but no further evidence surfaced. As the years went on, the case turned cold. Leads dried up. Detectives rotated out. Files were boxed and stored in the basement of the county courthouse. The small-town paper stopped running anniversary pieces after 2010. People moved on, but Helen didn't. Every June 14th, she placed flowers by the bridge and lit a single candle at the edge of the gravel road. She'd stay there until the candle burned out, even when the wind made it flicker and die. Then, in the spring of 2019, 16 years later, the sheriff's office quietly reopened the case. A newly assigned investigator, Detective Samuel Hurst, began reviewing old files for potential forensic reanalysis. The world had changed since 2003. DNA technology had advanced, databases had expanded, and cold case divisions were getting results in cases once thought impossible to solve. Hurst submitted several items from Lena's car for retesting, including that cigarette butt found near the driver's side door. It took months, but in early 2020, the State Crime Lab returned a partial DNA profile. Unfortunately, it didn't match anyone in CODIS and the National DNA Database, but it was a start. Hurst continued digging. He re-interviewed old witnesses, revisited the bridge site, and requested archived cell tower records from the night Lena disappeared. Though the phone networks of 2003 were primitive, triangulation data still showed her phone's final ping near the same stretch of gravel road. Still, without a suspect, the case languished again. The pandemic slowed progress. Helen grew older, her health fading. By 2022, she rarely left her home except to visit the bridge once a year. Then in January 2024, something unexpected happened. A man walked into the Sheridan County Sheriff's Office and asked to speak to a detective. He looked nervous, gaunt, carrying a folded newspaper clipping. He said his name was Evan Marks, 46 years old, a local construction worker who'd lived in the area most of his life. He sat down in the interview room, hands trembling. "I need to tell you something," he began. "It's about Lena Caldwell." Detective Hurst stared at him for a long moment, unsure if it was another false lead. But what Mark said next stopped him cold. "I was there that night," he whispered, "and I can't keep it in anymore." For the next 3 hours he spoke in halting sentences, his voice cracking. He told them about that night in June 2003, about the argument on the roadside, the flash of anger, the way things spiraled out of control. He described the bridge, the sound of the river, the empty stretch of road under the moonlight. Every detail matched the old reports. He even mentioned the lost shoe, the one found months later by a hunter. When detectives asked why he was coming forward now, Mark said quietly, "Because she deserves peace. And so does her mother." His story didn't sound rehearsed. He wasn't asking for leniency. He just wanted it to end. Still, investigators needed proof. They took his statement, recorded every word, then obtained a warrant to search his property. An old ranch house 30 miles north of Sheridan. What they found there would change everything. In the basement, beneath a loose floorboard, deputies uncovered a small wooden box. Inside were photographs, faded, water-damaged, and a cracked flip phone wrapped in a plastic bag. The phone's model matched the one Lena had owned in 2003. When examined by forensic technicians, they managed to extract the phone's SIM card. The serial number matched the one listed in the original case file. The evidence was undeniable. Within a week, Evan Marks was arrested and charged with second-degree murder and concealment of a body. News spread fast. For a town that had almost forgotten her name, the headlines brought back everything. Old wounds reopened. Reporters returned. The diner where Lena once worked was flooded with cameras again, and Helen, now 72, gave a trembling statement outside her home. "All I ever wanted," she said softly, "was to know the truth, and after 21 years, she finally did." But the confession wasn't the end of the story, only the beginning of understanding what really happened that night, and why it took so long for the truth to come out. The day after Evan Marks's arrest, Sheridan woke to the sound of helicopters again. News vans crowded the courthouse square, their satellite dishes angled toward a pale winter sky. The name Lena Caldwell was back on every screen. the young woman who had disappeared without a trace 21 years ago, now finally tied to a confession no one saw coming. Inside the sheriff's office, Detective Samuel Hurst stood by the evidence table, staring at the small wooden box they'd pulled from Marks's basement. The photographs inside were grainy, a few shots of the riverbank, a car parked on a dirt road, and one blurred image that looked like a woman's silhouette taken at night. The phone, though aged and brittle, held something even more important: its memory card still intact. When forensic technicians recovered its data, they found fragments of old text messages, short, almost mundane exchanges between Lena and her mother in the days before she vanished. The final one, sent at 10:47 p.m. on June 12, 2003, read, "Heading home. Love you." It was never delivered. That line became the centerpiece of every news report that week. Heading home. The words of someone who never made it back. Marks was arraigned in early February 2024. Shackled and pale, he stood before the judge and nodded quietly when asked if he understood the charges. His court-appointed attorney entered a plea of not guilty, pending further evaluation. Prosecutors announced they'd seek the maximum sentence. For the Caldwell family, the arrest brought a mixture of relief and disbelief. Helen told reporters outside her home, "I prayed for answers, not revenge. I just wanted the truth." Her hands shook as she held a framed photo of Lena, taken in the summer before she disappeared. Sunlight on her face, camera strap around her neck. "Now that we know," she said, "I can finally visit her grave and say the words I've waited 20 years to say." The problem was, there was still no grave. Despite Marks's confession, Lena's remains had never been found. When detectives pressed him for the location, he hesitated, then claimed he couldn't remember exactly. He described the area as near the river, under some old cottonwoods, but years of floods and erosion had changed the landscape. Ground-penetrating radar scans along the Tongue River turned up nothing conclusive. For Helen, that missing piece of truth was almost unbearable. "I can forgive him," she told one reporter quietly, "but I need to bring her home first." As the legal process began, the town's emotions were split. Some called Marks a coward. Others pitied him, seeing a man haunted for decades by what he'd done. A few even questioned whether the confession was genuine or a product of guilt and delusion. After all, they said, no body had been found, and confessions, especially after so many years, could be unreliable. Detective Hurst wasn't one to take words at face value. He'd seen confessions fall apart before. So, while the prosecutors prepared their case, he went back to work, quietly, methodically, to make sure there was evidence to back every line of Marks's story. The break came from an unexpected source: an old map. In one of the storage boxes from the original 2003 case file, Hurst found a hand-drawn sketch of the search grid near Red Butte Creek, the same place where the hunter had found the lone sneaker years earlier. The search area had been marked with red X's and notes from deputies who'd swept it at the time. But on the back of the map, in faint pencil, someone had scribbled a note: "Private land access denied." The property belonged to a local rancher named Bill Halford, who'd refused entry to search teams back in 2003, citing livestock concerns. Halford had since passed away, but his family still owned the land. Hurst obtained a new warrant and organized a search team. In March 2024, deputies returned to that forgotten patch of ranchland, 20 acres of rolling field bordered by cottonwoods and low brush. Using metal detectors and cadaver dogs, they began a slow, careful sweep. On the third day, one of the dogs alerted near an embankment about 50 yards from the river. The soil there was different, darker, softer, recently disturbed by seasonal flooding. When investigators began digging, they uncovered fragments of fabric, a small chain bracelet, and eventually human remains. DNA testing later confirmed what everyone already knew: it was Lena Caldwell. The discovery hit the town like a second shockwave. After years of not knowing, Lena had finally been found, and now her family could lay her to rest. Helen, frail but resolute, attended the small private burial that spring. She placed a single sunflower on the casket and whispered something no one else could hear. Reporters weren't invited, but they waited quietly by the road as the procession passed. When Helen's car slowed, she rolled down the window just long enough to say, "She's home now." That's all that matters. Inside the sheriff's office, Detective Hurst allowed himself a rare moment of silence. For him, it wasn't about closure. That word felt too neat, too final. It was about truth, and how long it sometimes takes to surface. As the trial date approached, new details emerged. Prosecutors released excerpts from Marks's confession, carefully redacted for the public. According to the statement, Marks had known Lena from the diner. He was a regular customer who often stayed late, nursing coffee and making small talk. Friends later recalled that Lena had mentioned feeling uneasy around him. Nothing dramatic, just a strange vibe. On the night of June 12, 2003, Marks admitted he'd followed her car after she left work. He claimed he only wanted to talk. They argued on the roadside about something trivial. Maybe gossip, maybe jealousy, he couldn't recall exactly. He said she tried to leave, he grabbed her arm and she fell, hitting her head on the rocks near the bridge. Panic followed. He said he thought she was dead. He placed her body in his truck and drove to the ranch land by Red Butte Creek, where he buried her beneath a cottonwood tree. He took her phone and the roll of film from her car, not to hide evidence, he claimed, but because it felt like a piece of her. For 21 years, that secret ate away at him. In the courtroom, the defense tried to argue diminished capacity, that Marks had suffered from untreated mental illness, that his confession was the result of guilt and delusion. They pointed to inconsistencies in his timeline and the absence of clear forensic evidence from 2003 that tied him directly to the scene. But the physical evidence told another story. The recovered phone, the bracelet, the fibers from his truck carpet that matched fabric from Lena's clothing. Piece by piece, the puzzle fit. During the preliminary hearings, Helen sat in the front row every day, clutching a folded handkerchief. Her presence was quiet but powerful. Even when graphic details were read aloud, she didn't look away. When asked later why she attended every session, she said, "Because for 20 years she was alone. I won't let her be alone again." Local residents lined up outside the courthouse, leaving flowers on the steps. For a place that had carried this ghost for so long, it felt like the whole town was mourning together. As spring turned to summer, the trial date drew near. Reporters from Cheyenne, Denver, and even Salt Lake City filled the courtroom gallery. The prosecutor, Karen Lewis, was known for her calm precision, not theatrical but relentless. She built her argument around the timeline, the confession, and the human story beneath it. On May 12, 2024, the trial of State of Wyoming versus Evan Marks began. Lewis opened with a simple sentence. For 21 years, a mother waited for her daughter to come home. And for 21 years, the man who could have ended her suffering chose silence. Her voice didn't waver. She let the words hang in the air, long enough for the weight of them to settle. Over the next 2 weeks, jurors heard testimony from forensic analysts, law enforcement, and even a few of Lena's old friends. They played portions of the recorded confession, Marks's voice trembling as he described that night. They showed jurors the recovered photographs and the small wooden box, now sealed in evidence plastic. The defense called a psychologist who testified about guilt-induced confabulation, how a person can convince themselves of actions they didn't commit. But under cross-examination, the psychologist admitted he'd never met Marks personally. The jury listened, solemn and still. Outside, the town remained glued to every update. Local radio stations replayed testimony summaries. Social media buzzed with debates about motive, justice, and forgiveness. For a place used to quiet plains and long winters, it was surreal. history unfolding in real time. Halfway through the trial, Helen fainted in the hallway outside the courtroom. Paramedics checked her, but she refused to leave. "I've waited too long to hear the end," she insisted, and she would. When the prosecution rested its case, Lewis turned toward the jury, hands clasped. "This case," she said softly, "isn't about punishment. It's about truth. And truth always matters, no matter how long it takes to find it." The courtroom stayed silent for several seconds before the judge dismissed everyone for the day. That night, as the courthouse lights dimmed, Detective Hurst drove out to the bridge. He parked by the same stretch of road where Lena's car had been found 2 decades earlier. The wind moved through the cottonwoods, the river whispering below. He stood there for a while listening, not for answers, but for quiet. He thought about how time changes everything, except grief, and he thought about the confession, and whether it was truly the beginning of closure or simply the end of waiting. By the second week of the trial, Sheridan felt like it had stopped breathing. The courthouse steps were never empty. News cameras turned even the quietest moments into spectacle. The shuffle of jurors, the soft click of Helen Caldwell's cane, the rustle of notepads in the gallery. Each morning the same faces waited in the cold. Townspeople, former classmates, even strangers who had followed Lena's story for years and just wanted to see it end. Inside, the air was heavy with the kind of silence that comes before something irreversible. Evan Marks sat at the defense table, clean-shaven, his wrists chained discreetly beneath the desk. His lawyer whispered occasionally, but Marks rarely answered. Sometimes he stared at the table, other times at the window, where sunlight fell across the wooden floor. He looked smaller now, not the looming figure from old stories, but an aging man who had spent 20 years pretending not to remember. On the 9th day of testimony, the prosecution called its final witness, Detective Samuel Hurst. He took the stand with his badge pinned neatly, posture straight, voice measured. "Detective Hurst," the prosecutor began, "when you reopened this case, what were you hoping to find?" He paused. "The truth," he said simply. Over the next hour he walked the jury through the timeline, the discovery of the old phone, the basement box, the matching fibers, the buried remains. He spoke carefully, letting evidence do the work. And when asked how he felt taking Marks's confession, he said, "It wasn't relief. It was responsibility. Because when someone finally tells you what they've done, it's your job to make sure it matters." The courtroom stayed quiet. When the defense took their turn, they tried to chip away at details, memory gaps, the missing hours in Marks's story, the lack of blood evidence in the truck. But Hurst's answers were steady. "Science doesn't always leave what time can't erase," he said, "but guilt does." That line would appear in every newspaper the next morning. By the end of the day, the prosecution rested its case. Karen Lewis, calm as ever, folded her notes and gave the jury a final glance that said everything words couldn't. The defense declined to call additional witnesses. There was nothing left but closing arguments. On the morning of May 27, 2024, the gallery was full. Helen Caldwell sat in her usual seat, first row center, with her son Daniel beside her. A framed photo of Lena rested in her lap, its corners worn soft from years of holding. When Karen Lewis stood to deliver the state's closing, she didn't look at the papers in front of her. She looked at the jury. 21 years ago, she began, a young woman left work, drove down a familiar road and vanished. For decades, her family wondered if she had run away, been taken, or if some cruel accident had stolen her from them. The truth is simpler and harder. She trusted someone she knew. And that man chose silence over decency, fear over truth, cowardice over compassion. She turned toward Marks briefly, then back to the jurors. "No confession erases what was done, but it can confirm what we've always suspected, that evil often hides behind ordinary faces." Her words were sharp but measured, like a scalpel, cutting without spectacle. Then came the defense. Marks's attorney, a man named David Crowley, walked slowly before the jury box. His tone was softer, more resigned than defiant. "Ladies and gentlemen, you've heard a confession," he began. "But confession alone isn't proof. My client is a man with a troubled mind, burdened by guilt over what he believes happened. There is no forensic link between him and the scene, no witness, no living evidence beyond his own words. Ask yourselves, could you trust the memory of a man who's been haunted for 2 decades? He gestured toward Marks. He has lived with pain, isolation, torment. Perhaps he wanted to end that pain by giving the world the story it demanded. That's not justice. That's surrender." He ended with a quiet plea for reasonable doubt. When the jury left to deliberate that afternoon, the courtroom emptied except for Helen and Detective Hurst. She looked at him, eyes damp but steady. "Do you think they'll see it?" she asked. "I think they already do," he said. Deliberations stretched into the evening, then overnight. The courthouse stayed lit, its windows glowing against the dark Wyoming sky. Reporters waited outside wrapped in coats, their voices hushed over live broadcasts. Inside, Helen refused to leave. She sat on a bench in the hallway with a thermos of tea, watching the door to the jury room as if willing it to open. Shortly after noon the next day, May 28th, the bailiff entered quietly and nodded to the clerk. The jury had reached a verdict. The courtroom filled again within minutes. You could hear every breath. Helen clasped her son's hand. Mark stared straight ahead. When the judge asked if the jury had reached a unanimous decision, the foreperson stood. Her voice trembled slightly as she read, "We, the jury, find the defendant, Evan Marks, guilty of second-degree murder." A gasp rippled through the room. Some cried. Others exhaled like they'd been holding their breath for 20 years. Marks didn't move. He just lowered his head. His attorney placed a hand on his shoulder, but he didn't react. Helen sat motionless. For a long moment she said nothing, then whispered, "Thank you." The judge set sentencing for June 21st. As people filed out, reporters shouted questions. Cameras flashed, but Helen didn't stop. She walked past them all, sunlight catching the edges of her gray hair, her steps slow but certain. Outside, the courthouse bell rang once, noon. Later that evening, local channels replayed the verdict footage in slow motion. The foreperson reading the words, Helen's faint nod, Marks's hollow stare. It felt like history closing a door. But inside the sheriff's office, Detective Hurst wasn't celebrating. He sat at his desk long after dark, reviewing case notes, evidence logs, and the small photo of Lena that still hung on the corkboard. He wasn't sure if he believed in closure. Maybe there was no such thing. Maybe justice was just a quieter kind of grief. 3 weeks later, the sentencing hearing began. The courtroom was smaller this time, stripped of the media crowd. Only family, officials, and a few locals were allowed inside. Marks was brought in wearing an orange jumpsuit, his hands cuffed, his expression tired. When given the chance to speak before sentencing, he stood, trembling slightly. His voice was hoarse. I don't have excuses," he said. "I've tried to remember that night for years. Some of it's clear, some isn't. But I know she didn't deserve what happened. I'm sorry for what I took from you." He looked toward Helen. "I wish I could give you peace." She didn't answer, but tears slid down her cheeks. Judge Langford, a firm but fair man who'd served on the bench for decades, leaned forward. "Mr. Marks," he said, "apologies are not currency. They don't buy forgiveness. But truth, even late truth, has value." He sentenced Marks to 40 years in state prison, with eligibility for parole after 25.